Hi, and welcome to the coding module channel. I believe it is more exciting to learn by application. So in this course, we will solve one of the advanced exercises of UiPath. This exercise will familiarize us with most of the practical activities of UiPath. In every part and training of UiPath that we will be using to complete this exercise, I will explain them in detail as I can. The name of this exercise is Calculate Client Security Hash. Here I have the document exercise hints that you can also download from the UiPath Academy, which is available within the Advanced Developer Training. I will use this as a guide as we progress to this course. And before we get started, make sure that you already have the following. First, the UiPath account. Next is the Orchestrator account. And last, UiPath installed and connected to Orchestrator. If you don't have them yet, please check the link in this video's description and the guide I created. It would be helpful if I showed you what this project would do after we built it. It will start by navigating the two applications involved in the process, System1 and SHA-1 Online. In System1, it will extract all the work items, which is the process data input. Then it will filter the work items to keep only items for calculate client security hash. The program will then navigate to each work item's details and extract the client information. The client information will be processed and hashed in the SHA-1 online application. The program will use the hash result as a comment for updating the work item, and the program will apply the same steps until all work items are complete. So without further ado, let us rock this course. In this exercise, we will be using the UiPath Robotic Enterprise Framework. So what is a framework? Alright, so instead of me explaining to you what a framework is, let me create our project and show you the framework we will use. Open the UiPath Studio. Here on the home page, look for the Robotic Enterprise Framework template. Select the template and let's give it a name. I'll name mine Calculate Client Security Hash underscore Crash Course. For the description, you can add a better one, but I'll say UiPath Crash Course. Going back to the framework, let us click this Open Main Workflow link in the middle of the canvas to open the main XAML file. You can also do this by clicking this main file from the project panel. So here is the representation of the UiPath framework. It is composed of four primary states, and you can already see the description of each state in the annotations provided. This framework will serve as a guide to organizing your project by segmenting the code related to handling the input, the applications, and data processing. This framework also provides a general exception handling when the code encounters an error due to a system or based on a business rule. You can check the documentation in the documentation folder to learn more about this framework. All these variables in the main workflow file are under the general business process scope and are accessible to all the states. The ones that we will often use for these projects are the transaction item, which will hold the individual input data, the transaction number. It serves as an index to the collections of our input data. For example, if we have 10 input data to process, the transaction number will be our reference to identify the following input to process. Then the config, this variable holds our configuration values in a dictionary form type that uses key value pair. We will explore more about that and the config file later. Then the transaction data, this variable holds the collection of our input data in a table format. This one is awesome. I cannot think of a similar variable type in another programming language like this. Close to this might be list or array, but later you know more about it. The guide's first item is about the transaction item variable, which says that it should be a data row. Let us make the changes in UiPath Studio. Make sure that the main container is selected, then open the variable panel. Look for the transaction item variable and change its data or type to data row. We will select data row because our input data comes from an Excel file, and the best variable type to hold each row of that Excel file is data row. By default, it is queue item. Choose that variable type when input data comes from the orchestrator queue. If you don't find the data row on the available option, click the browse for types and search data row. Once we make the changes, we will get errors from different program states. The transaction item variable is being used and mapped from those states. Now it produces errors because it doesn't have the same variable type as the variables it gets assigned. We need to fix these errors before we go to the next step. Let us start in the get transaction data state. Double click within the body of the state to open it. The triangle warning signs indicate that there are errors on its subcontainers. The red circle signs indicate the activities that cause the error. Using these signs is how you trace UiPath when the error is, or where the error is. Let us start this one. And it is an assign activity that assigns a nothing value to the transaction item variable. If the should stop condition is true, this error has been a common bug in UiPath since then. The quick fix is to remove the value, click outside the activity, assign the nothing value again, and click outside the activity. The next activity with an error is an invoke activity. In this case, we first look at the import arguments by clicking this button. Now, here we can see that there is an error in one of the variable mapping. If you want to know more about the error, you can hover your mouse on the red circle icon. It says we assign a data row variable type value to a queue item variable type. We cannot make the fix here because the variable that we need to update is within the invoke workflow. Remember, the variable name we need to change is out transaction item. Let us close this dialog by clicking cancel. Click the open workflow button to open the workflow file where we can change the variable type of the variable producing the error. Open the arguments window, look for the out transaction item variable and update its argument type from queue item to data row. Please save the file and close it. Now the activity we are fixing has a new indicator. This highlighted number indicates that this invoke activity has 7 arguments and there is one or more with no assigned variable. Click it to verify. The value of the out transaction item argument is now blank because we changed its argument type on its workflow. Assign the transaction item variable to it. The error got fixed because they now have the same data type. Click OK to close the dialog. We still have a warning, but we don't see where the error indication is. Find the error by expanding the other blocks like the exception and finally section. Here we find the error within the exception block of the try-catch activity. We already fixed this type earlier, so you know the trick. Look at the right corner of the main container to verify if there are no more errors. Let us go back to the main container and check the other states. Next is the process transaction state. Double-click within the body of the state to open it. The first error is from the invoke workflow activity. Again, open the arguments to validate the error. This error is a data mismatch, so we need to open the invoke workflow and update the in transaction item argument type from queue item to data row. Click Open Workflow, open the argument window, look for the InTransaction argument, and update its argument type to data row. Please save the file and close it. Click Import Arguments and reassign the transaction item variable. The next workflow activity causes the same error. Open the workflow and update the InTransaction item argument type to data row. Now we got more errors because the InTransaction item argument is related to these activities. We can fix this error, but since it is not critical to our project, we can delete it now. After deleting those activities, connect the increment transaction sequence to the flow. This sequence is responsible for incrementing the transaction number variable. Please save the file and close it. Click Import Arguments and reassign the transaction item variable. If we check the main container, it still has an error. The following error is in the business rule exception block. Open the try block, click Import Arguments and assign the transaction item variable to the InTransaction item argument. The last error is in the exception block. Open the try block, click Import Arguments, and assign the transaction item variable to InTransaction item argument. Verify that there are no more errors. Save and go back to the main containers. Verify that the main container doesn't have errors or warning too. To better ensure that the code is now clean, click the Analyze file and select Validate Project. We need to find and fix this error if you get it. It says here that it is from the Get Transaction Data workflow. Let's open the file and check the error. Here we can see that the Get Transaction Item activity causes the error. Since our data comes from an Excel file and not from the Orchestrator queue, we should delete this activity. Delete the retry activity surrounding that activity. Save the file and close it. Click the Validate Project again and confirm that there are no more errors. The next step in the guide is to create a new project we already did. The next step is about whiteboarding workflow. It is already in the guide, so we don't have to do it. But I want you to remember this whiteboard technique. I highly recommend doing it before you start coding your future projects. One of the mistakes I made during my early days in software development was when I got too excited about that development and skipped the detailed planning part. It caused me so many issues after I had already developed many modules. I kept on changing my approach because I did not make a good plan for it from the start. So using this whiteboard technique is like planning the blueprint of your project. Here you can organize and segment your code to easily maintain and support it. In this whiteboard, you will see the additional workflows we will create. It also provides description, precondition, post actions, and arguments. The next step is to develop our workflows. Let's create the three new folders for System 1, SHA1 Online, then Common. I used to create a folder from the File Explorer window, so click this folder icon to open it and make the three subfolders or the three folders as instructed. After that, refresh the project window to show the created folders. The next step is to edit the configuration file. The configuration file is inside the data folder. Open the folder and look for the config.xlsx file. So what is the importance of the configuration file? The configuration file helps us handle the initial data values of our variables like the URLs. We also use it to store values that might change in the future, like delays, Windows titles, and labels. Imagine if those values are hard-coded in the program or project. You would have to edit it instead of just changing it from the configuration file and feed it to your program. Let us start by adding the two application URLs that we need for this project, the Acme System 1 and the SHA1 Online. After adding the URL values, make sure to remove the hyperlink because it will give us errors if we run the project with a hyperlink value in our configuration file. The next value is the credential, and we have two options here. We can use the window credential or the UiPath credential. I think using the UiPath credential is more close to real projects. Before we create the credential in the orchestrator, we need to create an account first in the System1 application. Click the register button to register an account. I already have an account here, so I will not register again. So after you created an account in the System1, open your orchestrator by navigating to platform.uipath.com and log in into your account. Go to the Orchestrator tab, go to the Shared folder, then Assets tab, click Add Asset and create a new asset, then enter the credential you registered in System1. Copy the asset name and hit the Create button. Add the credential name to the configuration file. let's put the project name to the business process name, and then change the max retry number value to 2 in the constant tab. This max retry number indicates how often the program will attempt to process the transaction when it counters errors or failures. So after that, save the file. We have already completed changing the transaction item data type. The next step is to edit the init all application XAML file and invoke the workflows used to log into System1 and SHA-1 online. We don't have those workflows yet, so we need to create them. Let us use the whiteboard as a guide in creating the workflows. Alright, so let's start with the System1 login. So this workflow needs to have two in argument, one for the System1 URL and the other one for the System1 credential. And the task of this workflow is to open our browser and then input the System1 URL. So IE no longer exists in Windows 11, which is my current window, and we will be using Chrome as our browser in this course. If this is the first time that you use UiPath in Chrome, ensure that you have the UiPath extension installed in your Chrome browser. So you can check that by clicking your extension, make sure you have this. And if it's not installed, just click Home in UiPath Studio, go to Tools, and then click the UiPath extension and install to Chrome browser. Alright, and after you install that, make sure that you enabled it in your extension. So like this. And the post action is that after this workflow execute, it should open the System1 application and navigate to the dashboard page. So let's go to the studio and create this workflow. Let's start by right clicking on the System1 folder and then add a new sequence. And we will name this sequence System1 Login following the guide that we have. Hit create or enter. Then let us start by creating the two argument for this workflow. So the first one is the in system1 URL and the other one is the system1 credential. Okay. And then here in the argument, it is a good practice to use the argument direction as well as the prefix for the argument name. We use argument because we will invoke this workflow later from another and pass the system1 URL and credential value from the configuration file. Alright, so the next step here is to look for the get credentials activity. Go to activities tab and then search for get credential and drag it to our workflow. Now I will update the label name first. So get credential of System1. So for the credential name, it should be our input argument, which is the System1 credential. And then here on the Orchestrator folder path, remember earlier that when we create the asset in Orchestrator, we navigate first to the shared folder. So should be good. And then for the username and password, we need to assign variable to these two fields. Since we don't have variables yet for that, we can create the variable directly from here using Control K from your keyboard. So I will name the username and the password as password. And notice in the variable panel, let me select this first. Notice here that the variable we created has the correct variable type. So for the username, it's string. For the password, it is a secure string. So next step here is to look for the open browser activity because we have to navigate to the system1. Um, yep, just type in open and drag the open browser. Here we will also update the activity label indicating that we are opening system1. For the URL, we'll use our input argument for the system1 URL and make sure that the browser type selected is Chrome. If you don't select a specific browser type here, UiPath will use the default browser set in your machine. Okay, so um, right now we can test if this works, but we need to provide a default value first to our argument. So let me open my configuration file first and copy this value. So copy and again enclose it with a double quote. Same with the system1 credential. Copy this and let's go here. Alright, now that we have a default value to our arguments, we can now test this workflow. Let me make sure that my Google Chrome is clean. I will click run file to test and it works. It opens our system1, though we were not able to test our get credential yet because that will be the next step. So the next step is to type the username and password and we will use the type into activity. So let's go back to UiPath Studio and go to activity and look for the type into activity. Drag that within our open browser do container and it again it's a good practice that we update the activity label name. So let's start with the username and we'll indicate the username or email text box. So now we start interacting with web elements like the username field. So click this ellipsis button and select edit selector. So the selector is what UiPath used to remember and identify a a part of a web like the element we are dealing right now, the username text field. So you can validate the element in the selector editor if UiPath can locate it. If the validate button is in green, meaning the selector is good, and if you want to ensure that the UiPath can identify the element, you can use the highlight button. Like that is what will happen if you click that. Use the indicate element button to recapture the element in case you captured the wrong one. And the selector is composed of the element attributes. So when you indicate an element in the back end, UiPath captures all the element attributes. So let's open UI Explorer using this link in the selector editor to prove that. Here you can see the attributes we can use to identify the target element better. I will also select ID because it is usually unique per element and it is an excellent practice to validate the selector after you add or you remove attributes to the selector. So now our selector is updated. Click OK or click Save to save our update and hit OK to save the updated selector. Now for the value field,
we will be using the username variable that we created earlier. So at this stage of our workflow, after the get credential, we should have a value to our username variable, and that will be the value that UiPath will type in the username or email text field in the System1 application. All right, so the next step is to type the password in System1. So for the password, we cannot use type into. The activity we can use for secure string type of variable is type secure text. So this is commonly used for password value. Because remember, if you go to variable panel, the variable type of password is secure string. So if you try to use that variable in our type into activity, you will get an error because it's a data mismatch. So let's remove that there and return the username. Now, for this activity, again, let's update the label name to add password. Then we need to click this indicate element link to indicate our password field. And we can also validate the selector. We can use UI Explorer again to check if there are additional attributes that we can use. And in this case, it also has an ID, so we will select that one, hit validate, and to verify again, you can use the highlight button in here. Click save to save the selector. Go back to Studio and hit OK. And then for the type into and type secure text activity, there is a simulate type property. So it's a good practice to enable that property. And what the simulate type property does is it triggers typing values to a text box element even if it is in the background or not visible on the screen. So that will be helpful and to avoid errors, especially like what I said, if the application is background and this activity was executed. So we'll do the same with type secure text and enable the simulate type as well. Now we still have an error here because we don't provide a value yet for the secure text property. So for that, we will input our password variable, and we did not get an error because it's looking for a secure text type of value, and our password is a secure text or secure string variable type. All right, so the next step is to click the login button. And to do that, we will use the click activity. So going back to Studio, search for the click activity, drag it to our um, workflow, and then I will update the activity title to indicate what element I am clicking. So now I will indicate the login button and validate the selector. So in this element, we need to select additional attributes because the set by default is too generic. There could be other elements with the button tag and submit type. So let's use open in UI Explorer to see other or additional attributes that we can use. So in this case, we don't have an ID, so we'll go for the inner text. So at least now we have an inner text attributes that is for the login. So we can also use highlight and hit save. Now let's go back to Studio and hit OK to save that. So similar to type into and type secure text, there is also a property in click activity named simulate click, and it does the same thing. It triggers clicking element even if it is in the background or not visible on the screen. So we will enable that. Now that we have the type into and click to log in, we can again test our workflow. So let's close this one first because our workflow will open that. So save the workflow and click run file. And it was completed. We don't had any error and the login is successful. So this is the post condition mentioned in the guide. So now it is also or it is a good practice that we validate if the login is successful or not. We cannot assume that it is always successful. So we will use this dashboard label to validate successful login here as a reference. So let's go back to Studio and let's collapse this open browser activity first. And then we need to look for the element exists activity. So search that in your activity tab, element exists, drag that to our workflow and make sure that it is after the open browser activity, not within the open browser activity. So here we will indicate what element we are referring to. So I will just say dashboard label and I will indicate that label. Now let's validate the selector. Again, it's too generic, so in that case we need to find for more or add additional attributes. So here we can use the inner text again and I guess the class page header as well. So let's hit validate. We can click highlight and save that selector. Now going back to Studio, hit OK to save that. And for this elements axis activity, we need to create an output variable. So output is one of the attributes of that activity. So here I will just use this editor and I will create the variable directly in here and I will name it dashboard axis. And this variable is a boolean type. If the element exists, find that element, that will be set to true. If not, it will be set to false. And next to that, I will be using an if activity to validate if the login is successful, again by checking if it found the pattern that we check in here. So look for an if activity and then drag it here. So we can say that this if is to validate the dashboard exists. And then for the condition, we will use the dashboard exists variable. If it's true, it will go to this then block. If it's false, it will go to this else block. For the meantime, we will just use log message to to inform us if the login is successful or not. And at the same time, we will create another argument. This is not part of the guide, but later in this course, we will be using this argument. So I will name the argument out login status and make sure that the direction is set to out. And then for the argument type, let's set it to Boolean. And then here inside the then block, I will use an assign activity and I will just update the label name. Uh, so if the dashboard label is found, we will set the login status to true. Then we will also use a log message, but later we can add that. Let's use another assign activity in here for the again login status. And if it goes to this block, meaning that the login is not successful because it did not find the pattern. And then after the if activity, we will be using log message so that we can refer to this log later to check if the login is successful or not. So I will just update the activity title and we'll be using info for the log level and for the message, let's say login status, and then let's concatenate uh, the out login status. We need to convert it to string because the out login status argument is a type of boolean. So in order for us to print the value of it in a string format, we need to convert it to that using that to string. All right, so after adding those activities, let's go back first to system1, log out, and wait for the logout to get completed before you close the Chrome browser. And now we will test it again using run file. And it works again as we expect. And here you can see in the output panel, we have here a log message saying that login status is equals to true. And if we go back to the system one, yes, we can see here that the login is successful and the pattern we set is found in the element exists activity. All right, so that is all for our login workflow.
Next, we will create the workflow for opening SHA-1 online application. So let us start by right-clicking on the SHA-1 online folder and adding a new sequence. So let's name the sequence SHA-1 open, then hit create. So first we need an in argument where we can pass the SHA-1 URL. So name the argument in SHA-1 URL. Then look for the open browser activity and add it to our workflow. Let's update the activity label name by indicating the application we are opening. So it's a good practice that we always do this in every activity that we use. So input the in SHA-1 URL argument for the URL and make sure that the browser type is Chrome. Let's add a default value to the argument so we can test it. I will copy the SHA-1 online URL from our config file. Then make sure to enclose it with the double quote because it's a string type. And now let's click run file to test the workflow. And it works. So save the file and let's move to the next workflow. So now that we have the two open applications ready, let's invoke them in the init application workflow. So go to framework folder and look for the init applications. Double click it to open the init application workflow. So there are two ways to open the init application. So the first one is what we did. The second one is from the main workflow and then go to initialization state and look for an activity invoking the init application workflow. So if we look at the argument tab of this workflow, there is one with the name inconfig. The data type of the argument is dictionary. Since it is an indirection argument, it receives data from a calling workflow. So the data passed to these arguments are configuration file data. So imagine that all values we can see in this configuration file are now within in this config argument.
And this argument now represents our configuration file, and we can access anybody from the file using the key name. And now let us invoke the SHA-1 Open workflow, I mean the System1 workflow, and then click import arguments and map the config values. We can see here that the in arguments have default values because we test them earlier. So let's remove those values first before we proceed. Open the System1 Login workflow and remove the default values. And make sure to save the file. So the system1 URL and credential are part of our configuration file. So let's use the inconfig argument and call those values. So yeah, let's open the config file first. In the config file, the key is the name column. Copy the key name for the system1 URL. And then here, type in config and then indicate the key name for the system1 URL. And we are using that to string method because the value returned by config is an object type and we need to convert it to string. So let's do the same for the credential. Go back to config and then copy the key name for the system1 credential. And here let us create a variable for the login success argument. Alright, so now let us also invoke the SHA-1 Open workflow. Click import arguments. And we also did not delete the default value we used during the testing earlier. So let's open the workflow to remove the default values. And after making the changes, make sure to save the workflow. Let's copy the key name for the SHA-1 URL so we can access it from the configuration file. And hit OK to save the argument mapping. And since we cannot assign a default value to the inconfig argument, we cannot use the run file to test this workflow. So let us create a workflow, set it up, and then call the init all application. So create a new sequence and name it test workflow. So before calling the init all applications, the config variable should have values. To do that, we need to call the init all setting workflow first. And the init all setting workflow is part of the framework and designed to read the configuration file and save the value to a dictionary type of argument. So now that we have that workflow called, let us assign a variable to the argument and let's name it config and hit OK. So now that we have the config value, we invoke the init all application workflow and click import arguments to assign the config value. Okay. So before we test, check if there are no hyperlinks in the configuration file and the file should be closed. Also close all the Chrome tabs and now click run file to test our init all applications. And here we have a successful test.
Using the framework, you have your code organized by placing similar functions in one place like what we did in the init all application. The next part of the framework is the close all application. Can you guess what should place in there? Before we work on that, we need to create two workflows. One for closing the System1 application and another for closing the SHA-1 application. Let us start with the System1 close workflow. So right click on the System1 folder and select add new sequence. Name the sequence System1 close, and the first activity is the attached browser activity. Let's look for that activity. If that is available, just drag it to your workflow and update the label name. Before clicking the indicate browser on the screen, make sure that the application is open and that we are already logged in. So if the site is not open yet, we need to log in manually. So I'll copy the URL for the System1, and you are not logged in. Now let's go back to UiPath and click the indicate browser on the screen. Oops, you can press Alt Tab to activate the target screen. So we should be indicating this window. Again, make sure that you are logged into the System1. Now validate the selector by clicking Edit Selector, and here there are chances that the project will call this closed workflow while on a different pages of System1. If we investigate the application and navigate to work items page, you will notice that the page title is changed from dashboard to work items. If this happens, our selector will not work. We need to assume a scenario like this and adjust our selector to make it flexible. So now if I go back to my selector, hit OK disperse and click edit selector again, you will see that it is now not valid. So we need to adjust our selector to make it flexible. And we can notice that if we go back to the system, we can notice that only the latter part of the page title is changing. Like if I go back again to the dashboard page, yep, the latter part of the page title is only changing, but the Acme System 1 label is always there. So let us return to the selector and replace the latter part by an asterisk. So we will remove this dashboard and replace it with an asterisk character. So asterisk signs, when used in selectors, are called a wildcard. Using this approach, our selector can indicate the application as long as it has the first part of the title. So Acme System 1. And consider anything that follows it now. Now if we validate the selector, it should be good even if we are on the work item page. So I will go to the work item page again and click OK, edit selector again, and now it's still valid. Same thing if I go back to the dashboard page and edit my selector again, and it is still valid. Next, let us add a click activity, and this click will be for the log out button. So I will modify the label to also indicate what we are going to click.
And then after that, we need to indicate the log out link or button in our System1 page. So validate the selector by clicking edit selector. And I think we can make it a better one. So let's use open in UI Explorer. Um, this parent ID is, for me, is not that kind of reliable, so I will not be using that one. Instead, I will be using the inner text. And yep, href could be used as well, but it is not a good practice to use an href attributes in a selector. So for now, we are good with this one. So before we save that, make sure that you validate the updated selector. If it's still working, then save. And here we omit the parent ID attributes. Now click OK. So clicking the log out, if we go back to this page, could take some time, and it is also a good practice that we validate that logout is complete by referencing a pattern on the next page. So look here, if I click logout, it taking some time. So as a good practice, we need to uh, reference a pattern on the next page. So we will use the email text box as a reference to validate or to verify that the logout is already complete. So going back to the UiPath Studio, so here we will also enable the simulate click so that even if our web page or application is in the background of another application, it will still be able to click that logout button. Now we will be looking for an element exists activity. So if that's available, just drag it to our workflow next to the click activity. And let's update the label name, adding the username text box. And then let's indicate the username text field or the email text field. Let's edit the selector to validate if it's a good one. Let's see if there are additional attributes that we can add. So here it has an ID, so I will use that one and validate. Click save and OK. We need to add an output variable for this activity, and I will name it email exists. So I'll create the variable directly from here by pressing Ctrl K and name it email exists. And this activity has a property name timeout in milliseconds, and we will use that property to assign a maximum wait time for the username text box to exist. 1 second equals to 1000 milliseconds, and I want it to wait for at least 30 seconds, so that I will put 30,000 milliseconds, which is equivalent to 30 seconds. We will no longer validate if the user email text box exists or not, but just add a log message. So look for the log message activity and indicate if the email exists or not. So we can like add something like that plus or concatenate the email exists a variable value, but since it's a boolean variable, we need to convert it to string so we can print it as a text. So let us add now the last activity for this workflow, um, the close tab. So look for the close tab activity and add it to our workflow. This activity has no selector, um, and since it is within the attached browser activity, which indicates the System1 application, it will automatically indicate the same selector. Now, save the file and test it. But before we run, make sure you log into the System1 application because I clicked the log out earlier, so I have to log in again. And click Run File to test. And the test is successful. And we can see that the username text box indicates that the logout is complete before it closes the application. Next, we will create the close workflow for the SHA-1 application. So let's close this first and right click on the SHA-1 folder. Let's go back to the project panel. Look for the SHA-1 online folder. Right click and add a new sequence. Let us name this as SHA-1 close, SHA-1 underscore close and hit create. Let us add an attached activity or attached browser activity to our workflow. And again, update the label to indicate which application are we referring to. Oh, that's not System1, that's SHA-1 online. And again, before we click the indicate browser on screen, let's make sure that the application is open. I will copy the URL from the configuration file, navigate manually to the site. Once it is open, go back to the UiPath Studio. Now click indicate browser on the screen and activate the SHA-1 window. So click from there. Let's validate the selector by clicking edit selector and it looks fine. So I will not modify that. I'll just hit OK and then add the close activity or the close tab activity inside the do container. Save the file and now let's test it by clicking run file and it works. We have the two close applications ready and can work on the close all applications workflow. Let us open the close all application workflow. You can find it in the framework folder. Double click to open it. First, we invoke the System1 close within the System1 folder. The workflow does not contain arguments, so we don't need to map anything. Next, we invoke the SHA-1 close workflow within the SHA-1 online folder, which has no argument to. And to test this workflow, we need to open the two applications manually. And for System1, make sure you are also logged in. So I logged out earlier, so I have to log in manually. Same with the SHA-1 application. Once the applications are open, let's go back to the studio. Click Run File and make sure that the active workflow is the Close All application. Click Run File to test the workflow. And there we have a successful test. The next part of the framework we will work on is the kill all process. This part of the workflow is responsible for making sure that the machine environment is clean. Let us say, for example, what if the close all applications workflow did not work? It can cause severe issues because if the program runs again, it will be confused if so many open application window exist. The kill all process workflow is not specific to applications like what we did in System1 Close and SHA-1 Close. This workflow will target the browser we are using, which in this case is Google Chrome. So here we have to open the kill all process workflow first. And here, what we need is the kill process activity. So let's look for that activity in the activity tab and search for the kill process and drag it to our workflow. In this activity, what we need to input is the process name. But before that, let me update the label name first. It needs to kill the process of Google Chrome. So in this activity, what we need to input is the process name. So you can choose if you want to use the process or if you want to use the process name. But there's an additional step we need to do if we are going to choose process. So for simplicity, we will be using the process name instead. So we need to know what is the process name of Google Chrome before we can give a value to this process name field. So to check that, we can use Task Manager. So I'll just look for my Task Manager, and then here in Task Manager, go to the Details tab. And right now, I don't have any open Google Chrome or Chrome window or application. So let me try to open one. And now if we go back to the task manager, again, details tab, we can see that there are now some applications running with the name Chrome Exe. So this is the process name that we need. And we will be using that Chrome.exe. Let's go back to UiPath Studio. And here, um, the value should be of type string. So we need to enclose it with a double quote. So just type in Chrome.exe. And before we test, make sure that you have an open Chrome browser. And now going back to Studio, click Run File to test the workflow. And all right, we've got an error. But if you will notice, the UiPath Studio was able to close the previously open Chrome. However, we got an error. I will bypass this error for now by enabling continue on error property of the kill process activity, but we should find a good approach to handle that. But let me show you first how the continuum error works. Let me try to open a Google Chrome window again, and I will try to run or test my workflow again by clicking run file. And there we did not get an error. It was able to close the Google Chrome. But again, that is not the best solution for to that. We should find a better approach to handle that kind of scenario. Another temporary solution is to use a try-catch activity. So the program can inform us using a lag message that we got an error after executing the kill process activity. So I will uncheck the continue on error property here, make sure that is set to false. And in the activity tab, look for the try catch activity, drag it to our workflow, and then we need to drag the skill process activity inside our try block. Now let's add a new catch by clicking add new catch here. Here you will find different exception that we can use, and which is useful especially if you know what specific error the program might encounter and then handle it from there. For now, we will use the generic exception, system exception. Then let us add a log message activity to log the exception message or error. So look for a log message activity and then drag it inside our catch block. And I will select warn as the log label. And then here I will kill process, and then I will just concatenate the exception that message. Okay, so now let's open a Chrome browser again, and then let's try to run this and see how this will work. click run file to test, and it seems like we did not encounter any error when the kill process was executed. So let me try to open another Google Chrome. Let's see if the try catch will be triggered. And here, the try catch activity was triggered. And if we look at the output panel here in UiPath Studio, we can see the lag message that we add saying that the kill process encountered error while trying to kill a process. So, yep, instead of just bypassing the error, it's also a good practice that we are aware that there are some kind of exception like this that the program may encounter after we execute it. So that's all that we need for the kill all process activity. Just save the file and let's go to the next workflow. Our next step is to create the additional workflows for the System1 application. So let us create this in order based on the workflows dashboard. We will start with the System1 navigate to dashboard, and this workflow task is to navigate to dashboard from any page in System1. It also has one string argument that receives the System1 URL, and then as a precondition here that we are logged into the System1 and there's any page of System1 open. So let's go back to Studio. Let's start by right clicking on the System1 folder and then select add new sequence, and then let's name this sequence System1 navigate to dashboard, and then hit the create button. So the first step here is to create the in argument. So open the argument tab and let's name this in system1 URL. Make sure that the direction is in and the argument type is string. So the first activity we need here is the attach browser activity. So go to the activities tab and drag the attach browser activity. I will first update the label name to system1 page because when we execute this, it should be from any page of system1. So before we start indicating the browser and screen, make sure that you have the system1 open and that we are logged in. So I will log in first. And then let's go to any page from system1. I will choose this and then let's go back to Studio to indicate that page. Then let's validate the selector, click Edit Selector, and we cannot um, we cannot use a static title attribute for the selector because if we navigate to a different System1 page, the selector will no longer be valid. So let's click Open UI Explorer to check for additional attribute that we can use. So here the only available option is the URL, and remember that we have in argument in this workflow which is the system1 URL. So we will select this one and then uncheck the title. Now let's hit validate, and instead of using a hard-coded URL value, we can repair to our argument value. So to do that, to use your argument or variable within your selector, the how to do it is by let's remove this value first. You just need to enclose the variable or argument name in double curly braces like this. So our argument name is in system1 URL. Close it with double curly braces again. Now let's validate. It is not valid because we don't have a value yet for this argument. So let's go back to our studio, but let's save this selector first. Okay, just disregard that for the meantime. And now let's try to copy this URL value and use that as a default value of our argument. Oops. Make sure that it is enclosed with double quotes because it's a string. Now, if we go back to our selector, and now it's valid because we use a default value. But if we try to go to a different page, the selector, let's check if it's still valid. It's no longer valid because if you notice, if we go to a different if we go to a different system 1 page, there is a different values added on the URL. So this is the standard URL that we have in the configuration file. So to fix this, instead of the one with a different value, let's just use the standard URL to our selector. Let's close this one first. Again, and close it with double quote. And then let's go back to the selector, edit selector. And here we can use the wildcard, the same with what we did earlier on the previous workflow. So let's use wildcard so that any value after the standard URL can still be valid and can be identified by the attached browser activity. Let's try to validate and it's good. Now let's try to navigate to a different page again and check if our selector is still valid. Now I will go to this page, upload yearly report, go back to our selector, close that and make sure that it is still valid. So this is another learning how you can use variable in the selector. There are a lot of cases that we need to do that instead of using a hard-coded or a static value. So now we can click the or we can now navigate to the dashboard because we have a flexible selector that can indicate any page of the system 1. So in navigating to the dashboard, there are two options. It's either you click this home link, you will be directed to the dashboard page, or you can also click this Acme System 1 link in the header of the page. So it's on you if what option would you like to use, but for me, I will be using this header link instead. So let's go back to the studio and here I will add a click activity. Drag that to your workflow and then let's update the label to indicate what we are clicking. Acme System 1. Is that the correct name? Yep. And then I will indicate that link and validate the selector. So it is too generic, so I will use the UI Explorer to look for additional attributes that I can use. So here I can also use the inner text as well as the class because it refers to the navigation bar and hit validate. You can also click the highlight to ensure it's referring to the expected element. Now let's save it and going back to studio, hit OK. So now save your workflow and now we will test if it works. So before you test, make sure that you're on the different page of system 1. So I'll try this one, resource order, or yeah, vendor resource order. Go back to studio, click run file to test, and it works. And again, as a good practice for click activity, enable the simulate click property so that even if the system 1 application is in the background or behind a different or another application, this click activity will still work. So let's try it again by navigating to a different page. And now let's go back to Studio. Click Run File to test. And it still worked. But as you can see in here, it already finished the workflow, but the System1 page is still loading earlier. So if you also want to validate that the dashboard is open before you finish the workflow, we can add another activity here, which is the element exists activity. And then we can refer to the dashboard label as our reference to ensure that the dashboard page is loaded before we finish the workflow. So going back to Studio, let's update the label indicating the element we are checking. So I will indicate that dashboard label and then validate the selector. It is too generic, so I will add some attributes, and I will be using the class and the inner text. Validate, highlight as well, and now I will save that and hit OK. And if we go on to the timeout in millisecond, it is by default blank, but it has a default value in the back end. So if you want to know what is the default value your UiPath Studio is using, you can go to the project tab and then click this gear icon. And then we are using the UI automation classic activity. So click that one. And here you can see the default value being used during uh, runtime and during the debug run. So now we mostly run our file via debug, and here you can see that the default value assigned for timeout in milliseconds for both debug and run times is 30 seconds. So if you see that one of your activity property is blank, it is using what is declared or what is the value from the project settings. But however, you need to take note of this. If you put a value to your activity timeout property, what the UiPath Studio will follow is the one that you indicate. So if you put, for example, 15 seconds in here, it will wait for 15 seconds and not 30 seconds. Alright, so I hope that is clear. UiPath will only use this setting value if you did not indicate a specific value on the activity property. Okay, so I hope you take note of that. Now that we have the element exists, let's also test this. I will go back again to that page, which a bit slow when going back to the dashboard page. So now let's go back to Studio, click Run File. All right, so now you see that it checked or it checked for the dashboard label first before it finished the workflow. So that's for our first System 1 workflow. Next, we will work on the navigate to work item details. So next we will work on the System 1 navigate to work item details. So the task of this workflow is to navigate to the work item details page using the WIID as one of the input argument. And this workflow has two in argument. First one is the work items ID, and the second one is the System1 URL. So let's go back to Studio. Before we start creating the workflow, make sure that you delete the default value that we use to the argument of the System1 Navigate to Dashboard. After you delete the default value, save the file. Let's close that. And then let's start again by right-clicking in on the System1 folder and then add new sequence. And then name this one System1 Navigate to work item details, and then hit the create button. So let's start. with creating the two in argument for this workflow. So the first one is the work item ID. It's WIID of type string. And then the second one is the system1 URL, same of type string. And let's put a default value to both of these arguments that we will be using for later tests. So for the WIID, let's find the sample. Okay. Then look for a sample with the calculate client security hash description. So I'll just use the first one. And then since it's of type string, make sure that you enclose it with double quote. The next one is the system1 URL. So this should be this. Copy that and then enclose it with double quote again. Alright, so before we start creating this workflow, let me explain in detail first what this workflow will do. So its task is to navigate to the work item details page. So if we go back to the system one, if we simulate it manually in the application, you need to click the work items button first. And if you don't find any data in your work items page, you must first reset your test data in the user option and then click this reset test data and then just click reset test data and wait for the confirmation that the test data has been reset just like this. And going back to the work items page, in this table that we can see here, we have a columns for the work items ID, and that is one of our in argument. And to see the detail of each table row, click the magnifying glass icon. And the URL has two parts if you will notice from here. The first part is the link for the work items page, and then the second part is the work item ID. So since the work item detail page is following a pattern, we can navigate directly to each of the work item details page without doing the same step I did manually, like you go to the dashboard, click work items, and then click the magnifying glass icon. So we can just utilize the URL and just manipulate the URL to concatenate the work item ID that we want to navigate to. So now let us work in our workflow. Let's go back to the studio. So when this workflow is called, let's assume that the active system one page is the dashboard page. So let's start from that page. And then in UiPath Studio, let's start with an attached browser activity. So look for the attached browser activity in the activity tab and then just update the label. And then let's indicate the dashboard page and validate the selector. This should be fine, so I will not modify that. Next is we need to modify the URL or to create a URL for the work item. So what I will do is I will create a variable for this workflow. I will name this variable work item URL. It's a string variable type. And then we will be using an assign activity. Just drag that inside the do block or do container. And then I will update the label to say that this is for work item URL. For the to field, let's put the variable we just created. And then for the value field, I will use this value field. So you will see. So the first one is to make the work item URL, we need first the system1 URL, which is the in system1 URL. And then we need to concat the work item keywords. So let's go back to the system. Let's view one of the work item detail. Okay, let me go back because we need to make sure we are looking at the calculate client security hash example. So there's nothing in this page. Let me go to the next page. And this one is a valid example. So here, this is our system1 URL. So I'll just copy the next keyword for the work items. Copy that. Go back to Studio. Let's concatenate that with the system1 URL. And the last part is the WIID argument or the work items ID. So after that, just hit OK. And we are getting an error. Let me just check why. It is saying that, okay, so I forgot to enclose this keyword or these words to double quote because it was not considered a string. So make sure that you enclose this work items keyword within a double quote. Hit OK, and that should be good. And then now we have the URL to navigate directly to the work item details page. The next activity we need is the navigate to. So look for navigate to, drag that to our workflow, and let's indicate again here in the label work item detail page, and let's just put the work item URL. And then now we can test this code, but I reset my data, so I hope this one is still valid. So before we test, make sure that you are on the dashboard page. And then now let's test our workflow. Click run file. And let's see what happened. 404 not found, so it's probably because when I reset my test data that work order ID or work item is no longer available. So I will copy this one instead and go back to the dashboard page again. And in my studio, I will replace my default work item value with the new one. Then let me test this again. Click run file. And it was finished. Yeah, it worked. It navigate to this page. Okay, and I think a good practice is we should also add an element exists here so that before uh, UiPath Studio finish the workflow, we can ensure that the work item page is loaded completely. So let's add that element exists activity in our workflow, and we need to decide what pattern we can use. So I guess this is standard for all work item page. So I will just use that as my reference. So here, I will update the name and indicate that label from that page. I will edit the selector. Okay, it's not valid because this is a what they call the partial selector because it automatically use the attached browser URL selector, and I cannot use this inside that container. So we need to put this outside of the attached browser activity, and I will use indicate on screen again to indicate that pattern. edit selector. Now you will see that this is the correct web title. Now this is a pull selector. So earlier when it was inside the attached browser container, it is a partial selector. Now that we move it outside of the attached browser, it is now a full selector. The only difference is that when you are or when your activity uses full selector, you can also modify the title part of the selector. So now I will use UI Explorer to add additional attributes because it only capture or by default it only use the h1 tag. It's good that we also use the inner text. So I will validate. I will also use highlight to ensure. Then click save. Let's go back to Studio. Now this is a good selector for me. Hit OK. And let's go back to the home page or dashboard page again. Go back to Studio and test our workflow by clicking Run File. And it works. So this workflow is now good. Make sure to delete the default value that we use. And then after that, save your file and let's work on the next workflow.
The next workflow we will work on is the navigate to work items. And this workflow doesn't have any attributes. And the task of this workflow is just to navigate to the work item page. And the precondition is that the dashboard is open. So we will start from the dashboard page. Let's go back to Studio and right click on the System1 folder and add new sequence. Let's name this workflow System1 navigate to work items. Then hit the create button. So the first activity we need here is an attached browser activity. So drag it from our activity tab. Then let's update our label indicating what is the specific page we are attaching. So make sure that you have the System1 open and you are in the dashboard page. Now indicate browser and screen. Let's validate the selector. And then if you will notice, we can just directly go uh, to the URL of the work items. But since we don't have arguments, we cannot use the URL to navigate the work items page directly. So what we will be doing is just use a click activity to click this work item button from the dashboard page. So let's add a click activity and let's update the label indicating what element we are clicking. Then let's indicate that work items button. Let's check the selector and let's see if we can use the different attributes. It doesn't have an ID, so it used the AA name. We can also include the inner text and the type. Maybe we can remove the AA name. Let's also remove the parent ID. Let's just use the tag and the inner text as well as the type. Let's validate. Let's also highlight and save. Now let's click OK to save the selector. So here I guess okay, before we add another activity, let's make sure that the simulate click is enabled.
So as a good practice, it's also helpful if we add an element exists activity in here so that the or UiPath will wait for the uh, for a specific pattern before it finish the workflow. So to do that, let's drag a element exists activity and let's look up a pattern that we can use as a reference. So I guess this one should be the best candidate for that. Let's go back to UiPath Studio and I will just update the label and indicate that header label. Let's validate the selector. Okay, so I put it inside the attached browser for the dashboard page container. That's why the selector is showing not valid. So we need to move that outside of the attached browser activity. And let's indicate the selector again or the element and edit selector. Let's check what other attributes we can use. Let's just use the inner text, validate. It's also highlight just to make sure and click save. And yep, our selector is now updated. Click OK. And then let's create an output variable for this element axis activity. So I'll create it directly from here by pressing Ctrl K. And then I will name this work item exist. And then let's just add a lag message so we will know if the workflow wait for that element or not. Let's use info for the lag level. And then for the message, let's say work item label exists. And then let's just concatenate the work item exists variable. It's a Boolean type, so we need to convert it to string by using the toString method. Hit OK to save that. And yeah, that's all for this workflow. Let's test this, but first we have to go to the dashboard page first. And then let's go back to the studio, click run file. All right. We use the simulate click activity so you don't see the cursor going to the position of the button. And here we can see in the output panel that it wait for the label or to the pattern that we put in the element axis before it finish the workflow. So save this file and let's work on the next workflow. Now let's work on the extract work items data. And this workflow has one output argument and it's a type data table. And this workflow will extract the table of the work items page. So the precondition here is that the work items page is open. So we'll start from that page. Let's go back to UiPath Studio and code that. Let's start by right-clicking on the System1 folder and add a new sequence. Let's name this workflow System1 extract work items table. I am following what is indicated in the whiteboard of the UiPath guide. So hit the create button to create the sequence. So let's start by adding or by creating our output argument. And the name of the argument is out transaction data. Make sure the direction is set to out because we will send that value outside of this workflow later. And then the argument type should be data table. After that, the next step is we will be using the data scraping function or feature of UiPath, which is best for scraping table data or a data with pattern from a website. So before we use that, make sure that you have the work items page open in System1. And then after that, we'll click data scraping and make sure that you have that page open. So click next, and then you have to indicate any cell from the table. It could be the header or any cell from any row. Just select one cell, and then UiPath will identify that you click from a table element, and it will ask you if you want to extract the data from the whole table. Just hit yes, and here we can see how UiPath scrape the work items table. It is a good table because it has header, and we will use that header name later to access specific table column data. Below you can see a field for the maximum number of results. By default is 100. You can insert a different value here if scraping a specific or limited amount of data. If you don't know, put 0 to capture all results. So we will be using 0 or the value for all. So now let's click finish. And since our data is spanning to multiple pages, we will click yes here. And let's go back to our table. Then here we need to identify the button that will navigate the table to the next page. So instead of using the specific link or specific page, we can use this arrow button here because it always navigates to the next page. So let's indicate that. And yep, so the selector of that element as well as the table is now saved. So here, let's first modify the activity labels name. So here I will identify that I am attaching the work items page. And then here, let's say we are extracting the work items table. Then we can also check the selector of these elements or activities. So for the extract structured activity, we can look at the selector here. If you will notice, it only use the table attributes. And for this exercise, we can use that because we can see in the web page that there's only one table. So it should be fine. Now let's check the next link selector, and yep, it should be good as well. And here, this extract structured activity, it has an output property which produce a data table value, and by default it will create a variable. So we will not use that variable. I will delete that from the variable panel. And instead of using that variable name, we will be using our output argument, the one that we created earlier, and hit OK. So to test the workflow, let's add an output data table activity. So from the activities tab, look for the output data table. So this activity converts the data table value into a string type of data. So we can see it using a log message or a message box activity. So here, let's provide our data table name, which is the out transaction data. And then we also need to provide a variable that will store the text value. Since we don't have a variable yet for that, we can create that variable directly from here. Control K, and then I will name it transaction data underscore str. And then I will just use a message box. Look for the message box activity. And let's put here the string variable that we created. Oops, this one. And now we can test the workflow, but make sure again that you are in the work items page. And if not, you will probably get an error. So let's click run file to test this workflow. And let's open the work item page to see what will happen while this workflow is executed. And I'm not sure if you can see, but the page is navigating to the next page. And in every page, it scraped the table data and save it to the data table variable. So three more page to go. And here, so the workflow is now completed. And since we use message box and it captures a lot of data from the work items table, these are all those data. So we just test it. That's why it's in this format. So I'll close the message box now. And since we just use these activities for testing purposes, we can now delete them because we see that it's working properly. So delete those two activity, the output data table and the message box. And after that, save your workflow. We don't have a default value here, so that should be good. So that is all for this workflow. Let's work on the next one. Next workflow is the System1 extract client information. And this workflow needs three output argument, one for client ID, one for client name, and another one for the client country. And the tasks of this workflow is to extract the client information and put those value from to our output argument. So the precondition here is that the work item details page is open. So let's start creating that workflow. Let's go to our UiPath Studio. Right click from the System1 folder and add a new sequence. And let's name this one System1 extract client information. So let's start here by creating the three output argument. So first one is out client ID. Make sure the direction is out. Next one is the out client name. Again, it should be out. And last one is the client country and set it to out. Now, the first activity we need to drag to our workflow is the attach browser activity. And we need to date the label to indicate which specific page we are attaching. So, based on the precondition, it should be the work item details page. So let's go back to system 1 and let's look for a sample calculate client security hash item. So this one we can work on that. Click this icon and this is the work item details page. So we'll go back to studio to indicate that page and let's validate the selector. So that should be good. Next is we will be using a get text activity because we want to extract this client information. So look for the get text activity. So let's try to indicate the first information, which is the client ID. And if you notice, we cannot indicate specific data like client ID or client name. So let's use inspect element in Chrome, and we can see that all the details are in one paragraph element. That is the reason why we cannot indicate it separately. So we can get the value of the paragraph element and do some string manipulation to separate the client details. So let's go back to Studio, and again let's indicate the client information, and then I'll just click edit selector. So here we will not modify the selector because there are no more available attributes that we can use if we look at the UI Explorer. And you don't have to worry because this paragraph element or p tag is the first p element in that work item details page. So this selector should be fine. And then let's create a variable that will hold the client information or the complete client information. Let's name the variable client information. So that is now created. It's a string type. And then we should modify this label name. Okay, next to that is to do some string manipulation so we can separate the client ID, client name, and client country and then assign them to our output argument. So look for the assign activity. We'll start with the client ID, and let's put in the to value the argument for the client ID, and for the value, so we will say client information that's substring. If you don't get this string formula, then I will create a separate video to explain this formula that we will use in this workflow. But for now, just copy the same formula. So client information, you can activate the UiPath IntelliSense by pressing Control Space from your keyboard if you're using Windows, and then index up. So since we want to get first the client ID value, in order to capture that value, we need to find a pattern that we can use first. And this is the standard pattern that we can use to identify the location of the client ID value. So I will copy this and put that in here. And I will be using the dot length or plus the client ID dot length because this position might be 0. So for me to get the index position of my target value, I need to add the length of the string. And then we need to split it to environment dot new line dot to car array and 0. So this part is like from our target index. So if we find this first character index of our target value, so the next part of the string formula is to split the string until the uh, position of the new line. So what we are expecting is that assign activity should be able to capture this value. So let's hit OK now. I hope you were able to copy that formula. If you use a different variable name for the client information, make sure that you use that instead of this one. Now I'll hit OK. And before I proceed assigning the additional client information, I will test this workflow first. And instead of using run file, I will be using the step into from the debug tab. So this is a good practice when you want to debug your workflow, because when we click run file, it will run your complete workflow. By using step into, you can go on each activity in your workflow and validate each value if you want to. So here the first click in step into will activate the main container, and then it will go to the next available activity or container. So let's click step into. Now it's in the get text activity. If I click step into, it will execute that activity. And we can use this local panel to inspect our workflow. Or if, for example, we have a variable that is involved in this activity, we can check the value of that variable because we have this activity already executed. And that variable is the client information, and we have that here. And if you click this pencil icon here, we can see or access the value right now of that variable. So it captures the client information. So now our three arguments still don't have a value. But if I execute this one by clicking step into, we have now a value for our client ID. And it starts at GF, and there is a space at the start. Let's verify. G last character is 1. It was able to capture the value, but there should be no space at the start. So let me just continue and let me check my formula. Okay, it is because I did not add a space here after the colon. That's why there is a space added after the substring method. So let's hit OK. And now instead of uh, running using step into, since I knew that uh, the the other activity is working, I will just use breakpoint to this activity. So breakpoint is helpful or useful if you want to run your workflow and then stop at a specific part. Like in this workflow, I want to stop the run after it gets to this part of my workflow. And then let's use the debug file. Okay, now that it reached the breakpoint, it will stop here. And yeah, I will now click step into. And now we can see that it captured the correct value and we don't have this space now at the start of my client ID. So that should be working fine. I will just click continue and then add the additional assign activities. So to remove the breakpoint, you can click this. Let's add another assign activity, or maybe we can just copy this one because we will be using almost the same formula. Let's just modify the label and the to field as well. This should be for the client name. And then let's expand the value field and let's use the pattern for the client name. So let's add the space now and copy. And let's replace this two value here as well as this one. All right, hit OK. Now let's copy it again for our third argument, which is the client country. Let's change the to value to client country, and let's replace the pattern. So we should use the client country pattern or label. Let's go back here and replace this value. Hit OK. And now we can add a breakpoint here and debug our workflow. So add a breakpoint and debug file. Okay, it stopped at my breakpoint. Now we have the value for client ID and client name. Let me just confirm the client name. It's correct. Now let's click step into to capture the country, which is France, and that is also correct. So I'll just hit continue, and yeah, I know now that this workflow is working as expected. So I'll remove the breakpoint first and save it. So that is all for this workflow. Now we can work on the next one. All right, so finally we're at the last workflow for the system one, and this is called system one update work item, and it has two in argument, one for the comment and one for the status. And the task of this workflow is to update the work item status and add a comment. And the precondition here is that the work item details page is open, similar to the previous page. So let's start working on this last workflow. Go back to Studio. Let's start by clicking on the System1 folder and add a new sequence. And we will name this one System1 up, Update Work Item. So let's start by creating our two in arguments. The first one is for the comment, and the second one is status. They are both in argument and string argument type. So the next thing here is to use the attach browser activity. So let's drag that to our workflow and make sure that you have still the work item details page open. So I will just update my activity label name and indicate that work item details page. Let's validate the selector. Should be fine. Next is we need to click this update work item button. So of course, I know you know now what activity should we use. So let's drag the click activity and let's modify the activity label name. Make it a habit of updating your activity label name. That's one of the best practice in UiPath, because if you will notice, we don't often use comment or annotation, but having a proper label name to your activity, you can help yourself and other developer that might get involved to your project to easily understand what specific element you are referring to with this activity. So enough for sidebars. Let's indicate now the click button, update work item. Let's edit that to validate the selector. I think I should be good for me. Let's hit OK. And let's also enable the simulate click property of that button. And before we continue with the other activity, let's test this workflow first by clicking run file. And it works, and we can see that it open a dialog window, which we will be using for updating the work item. So this new window that shows up has a different window property. So we cannot include the next activity to the same attached browser activity. So instead, we will be using another attached browser activity, and then we will update the label. And I will just name mine pop-up dialog, or you can use update work item dialog, and I will indicate that dialog screen or window. Let's check the selector, and here you can see there's an additional attribute, the HTML window name. If we highlight, yeah, it's still indicating that window, so it should be good. Hit OK. And then uh, first is we need to input a comment. So we will be using the type into activity. So look for the type into. Okay. And let's update the activity label name and indicate that comment field. So let's validate the selector, and that should be good. But let's try to check if there are additional attributes that we can use. Yeah, look at here, it has an ID. So let's use this one, validate and highlight. Yeah, should be fine. Let's click save and OK here. Now for the comment, we will be using our in argument, which is comment. And we can also enable here the simulate type property. Then next to that is we need to select the status. So based on the value of our argument, we should select from this drop down element. So to select an item from a drop down element, we will be needing the activity name select item. So this is used for controls or drop down element. So let's drag that activity here, and let's change the activity label name. Now let's indicate the drop down button, and it does not support the select item. So if you receive this error when selecting a select element or a drop down element, so you can click OK that, and then we can edit the selector and click open in UI Explorer, and then instead of investigating the source code, we can click indicate element again and indicate that drop down element. And here it was able to capture a specific selector. So now look for the select tag, which is this one, and that is our target element. So I will select additional attributes in here, like the ID, and I think that should be good. ID is one of the best attribute we can use for selector. Let's hit validate. Let's try to highlight as well to confirm, and it works. So let's hit save and OK. So this activity, you need to select an item from a drop down, but you can also type a variable here. So our arguments here is the in status, so we'll use that one. You can also use take informative screenshot like this, because if the selector failed when you indicate the element, it will not create a informative screenshot. But still, you have option here to uh, change your informative screenshot like what I did. So now that we have the select, we can test the workflow by using step into as well. So before that, let me close this dialog or pop-up window and run my workflow using step into again. So let's hit step into, and now it will click the update work item. Oh, not yet. Yep, it should be, the pop-up window should be available now. Okay. Now it's going to the second attach browser activity and it will type the comment. Okay, let's see if it was typed. Okay, so we did not we don't have a value to our comment and status. So let me can I drag it? No. Okay, let me stop it from here and let me close the pop-up window. So going back to the studio, I will put a breakpoint in the second attach browser activity to stop the program from this part of the workflow. So let's click the breakpoint. Now instead of step into, I will use debug file. Okay, it opens the pop-up window now. So here, if you don't want to put a default value to your argument, because sometimes we forgot to delete it, you can test your workflow using debug, and then you can use breakpoint as well or step into, and you can utilize this window here where you can see the value of your variable and some of the settings. And here we also have an immediate window. So in immediate window, you can assign value to your variable. So if you want to use sample data, for example, in our comment variable, we can assign from immediate window. I will just use sample comment and then hit enter. Now, if we go back to our local window, we can see here that our comment variable or argument has now a value. Let's do the same for our status argument. I will assign a temporary value. It should be completed. Make sure that the spelling is correct. If you also use rejected or open. So now we have those value placed to our in argument. Now let's use step into so we can see how this will work. It starts with the comment. Let's see if the comment was added. Yes, sample comment is added. Now let's execute the select item. So I use completed as the value. Let's see if it was selected. And yes, it was selected. So the next step is to click this update work item. So let me just click continue now to end this workflow. And I will remove this breakpoint now. So next step is we need to add a click activity to click the update work item button. Let's indicate that element and validate the selector. Should be good. And we can also enable the simulate click as a good practice. Now let's run this workflow. But first we have to close this window. Now let's use run file. Okay, we get an error there. It's because again we don't have a value for our argument, so I should not use run file in there. So I will add the breakpoint again in the second attached browser activity and use debug file, but make sure that the dialog window is closed. Now hit debug file. Okay, now let's give some value to our in argument. Let's start with the comment. I will assign a sample comment. And then for the status, I will use completed. All right. So now we can, let's see our dialog first. There's no value yet. Let's hit continue. Okay, so you did not get any error. Let's see what happened. Right, it was successful and we have this pop-up dialog. So we need to click this OK button. So let's add a click activity and let's update the activity label name and indicate that OK button. And let's validate the selector and it seems fine to me. I'll try to highlight to validate. Yep, this should be good. We can also enable the simulate click. And if you want to quick test if this click activity is working, you can use the test activity. If you right click on the activity, select test activity, and then click continue. And we get an error. Seems like it encounters some error. Is the pop-up still there? It is. Let's check the selector again. I stopped the debug. Edit the selector. It shows valid, but why it did not work earlier? So instead of using test activity, maybe we should test it from the start of the workflow. So let's click this dialog first and hit OK. So now let's use. Okay, we cannot use run file, so I have to use debug file so I can manually assign value to our in arguments. All right. So now can I just copy? I think I can just copy this. Yep. Same with the status. I will just copy that. Okay, now we have value to our two input arguments. Now let's hit continue. I will bring the pop-up in front so we can see. Okay, it was able to click the pop-up OK button now, but we still have this window open. So we need to close this window as well by clicking this close button here. So let's add that click activity and let's update the label name close pop-up window and let's indicate that element. Let's validate the selector and yeah, I think it's good. It's a close name control. Let's also highlight to validate it's indicating that element, so it should be fine. We can also enable the simulate click here. And now let's test. But before that, I will update this first to open so that later we can validate if it was really updated to completed. After that, let me refresh the page. It should show open now. Yeah, it is open. Now, I will use debug file again so I can assign the value to our input arguments using immediate window. Okay, stops now, and now let's assign um, some value to our arguments, and the status will be completed. Now we have value. Let's hit continue, and let me bring this in front. Okay, all right, so it works. Now let's validate if it really works. So if I refresh this should be showing completed now, and it is. So that is all for our update work item, which is the last workflow for the system one.
Now we are on the last two workflows. One is for the SHA-1 online processing hash and the other is for email sending. So let's start with the SHA-1 online processing. The workflow has two arguments, the hash formula and the hash result. So the workflow task is to retrieve the hash result of the input data. So let's go back to the UiPath Studio and build the workflow. Start by right-clicking on the SHA-1 online folder and select Add New Sequence. And name the sequence SHA-1 online process hash and hit the create button. So here let's add the two arguments. The first one is the in hash formula and the direction should be in of type string, and the second one is the out hash result, and make sure that the direction is set to out. All right. As a precondition, the SHA-1 online application should be open when executing this workflow. So make sure that you have the SHA-1 online application first in your Chrome browser. So in the UiPath Studio, let's add an attached browser activity. And I will just update the activity label name. Next, let's indicate the browser on screen. And next, we need to input value to this SHA-1 text field. So let's use the type into activity to do that. Let's go back to UiPath Studio and look for the type into activity. Drag that within our do container. And I will just again update the activity label name. So SHA-1 text field. And let's indicate the text field. Let's validate the selector. So let's use UI Explorer to see additional attributes that we can use for the selector. And here we have ID, so I will select that one, hit save, and hit OK. And we can also enable the simulate type property of the type into activity. And then for the text value field of this activity, let's use our in hash formula argument. So next we need to click this hash button in the SHA-1 application. So let's use click activity for that. Go to UiPath Studio and drag the click activity after the type into. And let's just update the activity label name and indicate the click button. Let's validate the selector and maybe we can see additional attribute that we can use. So let's open UI Explorer and here we can I guess also use the AA name because it has the word hash. Alright, I think that should be fine. Let's validate. We can also use highlight to verify and hit the save button.
So let's go back to Studio and hit OK. And we need sample input data to test what we have done so far. So I will just use the argument default value field to do that. And I will assign a default value to our in argument. So the input data format is similar to this dash client name dash client country. All right. So now let's run this. I will use run file. Okay. We see here that our workflow was able to input data, and after clicking the hash button, we got a hash result in here and it was highlighted. So the next step is to capture that hash result value and then save it to our output argument or the out hash result. So to do that, let's use a get text activity. Let's go back to UiPath Studio and then look for the get text activity, and I will update the label name and indicate that hash result. Let's validate the selector, and we should use UI Explorer to add additional attributes. Okay, right, goes there. So here we have an ID as well, so we will use that one. Let's click validate and highlight. We can confirm that it's indicating our target element. So here we can hit save and go back to Studio and hit OK. And we will assign the out hash result argument to the output value of this getText activity. So go here on the output property, and here let's put our output argument, which is out hash result. Hit OK. And we can also add a lag message to this workflow to print the hash result. So let's look for the lag message activity. If that's not available, search for it. Lag message. We can also update the label name of this activity. And for the lag level, I will be using info. And the message is, I'll put something like hash result and then just concatenate the out hash result. It's already a string, so we don't need to convert that to string anymore. And this workflow will run several times depending on the number of the transaction item. So we need to consider refreshing the page after processing each item. So after each item, we just need to click this back button, or just like trigger a back action on the SHA-1 page so that it will return to this page status. So in UiPath, we have an activity that do an action like that. So going back to the studio, let's look for the go back activity and then drag it to our workflow. And yeah, there's no attribute that we need to modify here, so it should be fine. It automatically uses the attached browser selector to identify the page where you want to run it to. So now we can test this workflow. Let's make sure that we are on this page of the SHA-1 Online. We can delete the value manually before we test our workflow. And now I will use run file. And it works. We can see in our output panel the hash result captured by UiPath. And if we go back to SHA-1 Online, the go back activity was executed, so it returned to the initial page of the site. So go back to UiPath Studio, make sure to delete the default value that we use, and then please save the file and close it. So the last workflow that we need to build is the send email. So the workflow requires an Outlook application and has three in arguments. So the program will use the workflow to inform a given email address or a distribution list of an exception during runtime. And it is common in RPA projects, especially if the program runs in unattended mode. So sending an email can also be used to inform people when the program starts running or when it is finished. So let's go back to UiPath Studio. Right click on the common folder. Let's go to the project tab and start by right clicking in the common folder and add a new sequence, and we will name this sequence send email and hit the create button. And here let's start by creating the three in arguments. So open the arguments tab and let's add first the to argument, and then the subject, and last one is the body. So there is no from argument because sending an email using the Outlook application automatically uses the login account as the email sender. So here the only activity we need is the send Outlook email activity. So go to activity tab and look for the Outlook activity. And we cannot find any activity related to email even if I search email in here, because it is not added by default when we create the project. So before using email activities, we must install the email package first. So click the manage packages from the ribbon and go to the all packages and search for the UiPath.mail.activities. Alright, so select the package and click install, then hit save. Alright, so once the package is installed, go to the Activities tab and look for or search for the Outlook activities. So now we have a lot of available activities that we can use not only for Outlook but also for Gmail, as you can see in here. So we need to look for the send Outlook mail message. So this one, drag that to our workflow, and we have to update the activity label name as a good practice. I will just add exception in here because for this project purposes, we will only call this workflow when sending exceptions. So now let's assign our argument here. So I will, for the two, we have the two in argument. For the subject is the in subject, of course, and for the body, it should be in body. So we can test this workflow by assigning default values to our in argument, and I will use the immediate window to assign values and debug file to test the workflow. So go to the debug tab if you want to do the same thing. You can also use argument to put a default value, but yeah, but I think it's better to do it in here as well sometimes. So click step into, and before you assign a value, don't start assigning value in immediate window when you are on the main container. Make sure that you are on the first container within the workflow, because you will get an error if you assign a variable within this container. So now that we are uh, on the send Outlook mail message activity, we can use our immediate window. And for the into argument, I will be, where should I send it? Maybe I should send it to my own email so I can verify if it was successful or not. So coding module owner@gmail.com. And then for the subject, I will just use UiPath test subject. And for the body, I will just use test body for exception message. Hit enter. And now we can press continue to finish this workflow. And we don't have any indication of any error after we execute that activity. So to verify if it is successful or not, open your I sent it to my Gmail email account, so I will check it from Gmail. And here I received the subject with my Outlook account user and the subject that I put in immediate window as well as the body of the email that I use. So if you was able to successfully test your workflow as well, make sure to save it. And now we will close it. So we have now completed all the additional workflows. And the next step for us is to invoke those workflows in the framework. So let's work on that. The next workflow we will work on is the get transaction data workflow, and the get transaction data state invoke that workflow. So as the name implies, this framework state is responsible for handling data or input. In this state, we can also create some validations of the data before we send it to the process transaction state. We can also validate if there is more data to process or if we should stop the program. So inside the get transaction data state, the first activity you will see is this check stop signal activity. The stop signal is from the orchestrator, which you can trigger if you create a process job. In this project, we will not deal with that, so I better explain that on a different topic. And the output variable of this activity's name should stop, which is a Boolean type. And if we look at that variable in our variable panel, it has no value, and a Boolean variable with no value is by default set to false. So if we check this condition here, it will always goes to the else block, which calls the get transaction data workflow. Clicking import arguments, we can see all the arguments and variable being passed to this workflow like the transaction number, the config, and the transaction data. Then this workflow outputs transaction item, transaction field, and transaction ID. So now let's click open workflow to open our get transaction data workflow. Inside the workflow is a default condition and some variable assignment. And we will not use this, so let us delete this. And we will follow the guideline for the condition and variable assignment. So first we need to check if this is the first run of the workflow. To do that, we can use the in transaction number argument as a reference. So let us create an if condition to do that. So look for the if activity in your activity tab. And here let's update the activity label name to, and then for the condition, it should be in transaction number equals 1. So transaction number default value in framework is 1. And we can verify that if we go to the main workflow and if you look at the variable tab and search for the transaction number, so the default value is 1. And if that is the current value of the transaction number argument that we have here, we know that it is the first time this get transaction data workflow is called. And if the value is 1, we must invoke the System1 workflows to extract the work items. So let's first invoke the System1 navigate to work items. So go to your project tab and expand the System1 folder. and look for that, navigate to work items and drag to our workflow. And this workflow does not have an argument, so we don't need to assign a variable. You might ask, why did we start with navigate to work items? Shouldn't we invoke the System1 login first? Well, it is because at this project stage, the expectation is that System1 is open and we are logged in. System1 login is invoked on the init all application workflow, which is part of the initialization state. So next we invoke the extract work items data table. It's also within the System1 folder. So look for that System1 extract work items data table, and it has arguments. So click the import arguments, and here you will know that the workflow produces transaction data of type data table, and it is like asking where we would like to assign that output value. So let's assign that to our IODT transaction data argument. And this transaction data variable is part of the framework, and notices how it is appropriately named. The name starts with the argument direction, an input output, followed by DT, a prefix for data table. So hit OK to save that. The next step is to filter our transaction data because the extract data table workflow extracted all the items from system 1, and not all those items are for calculate client security hash. Let's go to system 1 to show you that. So if we go to work items, here in this table is a description column indicating for which exercise the item is. And here is an example or an item for the calculate line security type or security hash, which has a type of WI5, and we will use that type for our filter formula. Then there is also a status column that indicates which items are still open and completed. We will also use that status column for our filter formula because we want to avoid processing completed items again. So let's go back to UiPath Studio to do the filter. So there are two ways to filter a data table. The first is using an assign activity, and the second is using the filter data table activity. So UiPath created the filter data table activity for that purpose, so let's use that one. So go to your activity tab and look for the filter data table and drag that to our workflow. And let's update the label name first as a good practice. So first indicate that data table that you want to filter. So here we will put our IOTT transaction data argument, and then click the configure filter to define our filter condition. If you want to keep or remove the filtered items, there are two filter options here. We will use the keep option. And now we can define our filter condition and indicate the column, the value, and operation. So for the first condition, we will indicate the type as the column. It should be a string value, so enclose it with double quote. The operation is equal, and the type should be WI5. And then let's click this add sign to add additional condition. The second condition is for the status. Make sure that you spell it right. And the operation should also be equal and the value should be open. So if you are curious where I get those value, those are part of our guide. Here it was indicated that the type should be WI5 and the status is open. All right. So next we need to define where to store the filtered items, and we will assign that to the same variable, the IODT transaction data, instead of using or creating a new one. So once you have completed all of this, just hit OK to save this filter. setup. And before we proceed further, let's test what we have done. So we make sure that the system1 is open and the active page is the dashboard page. And then let's add a breakpoint to the if activity. So go to debug and I will be using debug file. Let's use debug file to test this workflow. And now it stops to our breakpoint. So if you will notice here in the locals panel, we can see that all our arguments don't have value except for the transaction number, which is set to 0 by default because it is an integer type. So we need to set its value to 1, which is the framework default value. And I will use immediate window to do that. So here just type the argument name, which is in transaction number, and then the value. It's an integer, so don't enclose it with a double quote. Hit enter, and now if we go back to local panel, the value now is updated. So now let's also add a breakpoint to the filter data table activity. And then after that, click continue. Okay, now the program paused at our second breakpoint. So let's inspect what is our transaction data value before we filter it. So go to the locals panel and click the pencil icon beside the IODT transaction data. Here we can see all the work items of the different types because we haven't applied the filter yet. So I will close that. And now I will click step into to execute the filter data table activity. Now let's inspect our transaction data variable again. And oops. And here the only items left are the WI5 or calculate client security hash with the open status. All right, so hit OK. We can finish the workflow by clicking continue. And after that test, make sure to remove the breakpoints. I just use breakpoints so that I can show you the transaction data, the value on each part of this workflow. So at least you also have an idea what is happening in the back end. All right. So we also need to log the total number of filtered transactions. So let's use a log message activity to do that. Look for the log message, drag that to our workflow, and then let's update the label name to transaction count. And I will be using info for the log level. And then for the formula, I will use this editor. So let's add some string in here. Transaction items count. And then let's concatenate the IODT transaction data. To get the row count, we will use the row count. And we need to convert that to string so that we can print it later in our output panel. So hit OK after you type that. And now that we have a transaction data to process, let's start assigning value to the output argument. So collapse the if activity first, and then we will add another if activity to check if the current transaction number argument value is less than the number of the transactions. Let me use another if activity here first, and then indicate that if transaction number less than transaction count. And for our condition, we will use IN transaction number is less than the IO transaction data dot row count. Later, we will access each row of the transaction data using the transaction number as the index. And the data table index starts at 0 and the transaction number value begins at 1 because that's the default value in the framework. So the next step for the then block is if the condition is true, we will assign the current transaction data row to the output or to the out transaction item variable. So we will use an assign activity to do that. Look for an assign activity. I will change the label name to transaction item. Then let's say out transaction item is equals to, I will expand the value field. It should be equals to IO data transaction data dot row. So this is how we access each row of our transaction data. And here we'll put the index. So for the index, we will be using the transaction number minus 1. Remember, the transaction number here starts at 1. And since the index of data table starts at 0, we need to less 1 to the current transaction number so that you will be able to process all the transaction data. And this formula outputs a data row object type that matches our out transaction item argument type. So hit OK after that. Then if the condition is not met, let's click this else tab. We will assign nothing to the out transaction item variable. So let's drag another assign activity. Indicate here and then here out transaction item. We will assign a nothing value, which is an indication that there's no more item to process. That will trigger the end of the framework or our project. And that is all for the get transaction data workflow. Make sure to save that file before we move on to the next part.
Now let's work on the process state of our project. So go inside the state, and here we can find an activity that invokes the process workflow. So let us check the argument involved in this workflow by clicking import arguments. The first one is the in transaction item, which is the output of the get transaction data workflow. So at this stage, this transaction item variable should have a value based on the current transaction data row. And the next variable is the inconfig, which holds the configuration file values. Later, we will need data from our configuration file, and we can easily access those using this inconfig argument. So let's hit OK and then click Open Workflow to open our process file. So the first step here is to invoke the System1 Navigate to Work Item Details workflow. So look for that workflow within the System1 folder. Navigate to work item. So it has arguments that we need to assign. So here for the in WIID, we will assign the transaction item WIID column. So to do that, we need to use this formula. So let me just expand this. So it should be in transaction item that item and then the column name, and we need to convert it to string.
So the in transaction item here refers to our current transaction data row, and then the item WIID refers to the WIID column of that row. So we use toString to convert the output data of the formula to a string type. For the in system1 URL, we will use the inConfig variable and access the key name that holds the value of the system1 URL. Let me click OK first and open the configuration file to show you. So go to the data folder and open our config file. So here is our key name for the system1 URL. And I noticed earlier that we have the wrong URL value here. So if you still have the login keyword in your system1 URL, make sure to remove that because we will concatenate this URL value to navigate directly to each work item details page later. So yeah, again, make sure to remove that login word in there, and make sure to remove the hyperlink as well, and then copy the key name for the system1 URL. So and make sure to save the file after making the changes. Now let's go back to Studio, click import arguments, and let's get the value from the config variable by using the key name for system1 URL. So hit OK to save that. Next, we need to invoke the system1 extract client information workflow, and that is also within the system1 folder. So yeah, drag this extract client information. It also has argument that we need to assign, so click the import arguments, and this workflow produces this data and we need to assign a variable to store those value. I will create the variables directly from here using the control K, client ID, and here is client name, and for the last one should be oops, client country. Now it was doubled. Uh-huh. Okay, let's just use that and hit OK. And if you did that as well, uh, we have those variables now created in this workflow. So next is we will invoke the SHA-1 online process hash to hash the client information. So that is within the SHA-1 online folder. So drag that workflow here, then click import arguments to assign them. So for the in-hash formula, here we need to combine the client information and use a dash or hyphen in between. So let me just expand that field. So you will see the formula I will use. Let's start with the client ID, and then let's concat a hyphen or a dash character followed by the client name, and then another dash character and the client country. And make sure that there is no extra space before and after the dash character. Having just one extra space there will produce a wrong hash value, so avoid that. Then for the out hash result, we will create a variable to store that value. So I'll press Ctrl K again, and I'll just name it hash result. So now that we have the hash result of the client information, we can update the work item comment in system1 and the status to completed. So let's invoke the system1 update work item and click import argument. So for the in comment, let's assign the hash result variable, which is the output of the SHA-1 online process hash workflow. And then for the in status, let's assign a value completed and hit OK. So after we update the work item by executing this workflow, next step is to navigate to System1 dashboard page. So we need to look for the System1 Navigate to Dashboard workflow in here and click Import Arguments. And then again, we need the config variable and let's copy the key name for the System1 URL. Go back to Studio and then use the in config and define the key name, which is System1 URL, and then hit OK. So after that, save the workflow. Now we can test our project from the main workflow. And before the test, ensure that the configuration file and your Chrome or Google Chrome browser is closed, but make sure to also log out first in the System1 application. I also recommend resetting the test data so you will have a new set of test data to process. So let's close that and we can use the run file button since we have the main as the active workflow, but the proper way of running the project from main is by clicking run. So if you click run, even if the active workflow is not main, it will still automatically run the project from main. So now let's click run to test the project. And if it gets another error, it will terminate the program as what happened now. So I encountered an error. Yeah, this error saying that the System1 dashboard page selector could not be found. And that error came from the System1 navigate to work item details. Okay, so if we check the guide, the precondition on the navigate to work item details is that the System1 is open on any page. And if we inspect our workflow, here in the attached browser activity, if I edit selector, it assumes that the System1 is open on the dashboard page, which produces our error because when this workflow is executed, the current System1 page is the work item page. So instead of using the title attribute in here, we will replace it with the URL because we need to make this selector flexible to any page of System1. So to fix that, hit OK first, and then let's first indicate the System1 application. So any page in System1 application should be fine. And then edit selector and click open in UI Explorer. Okay, let me put that in here. And then here we have to select the URL and uncheck the title attribute. And then we need to remove the hard-coded value of the URL and replace it with the URL argument. So let's remove that and let's start with the double curly braces and input our system1 URL and then close it with the double curly braces again. Of course, if we validate this, this will have no, this will not be valid because we don't have a value in that argument. Let's hit save. And another thing, please don't forget this. Make sure to add an asterisk character to our URL value. This is a wildcard character, so that will make our selector flexible in any page of System1. So let's hit validate. Let me check if I can test that. I will use this. And then here you can test this by adding a, oh no, sorry, forgot what I'm saying. So hit cancel. Later we will see, but this selector should be fine now. So hit OK to save that updated selector, and also make sure to save the workflow to save the changes. All right, so after we did that, let's test our workflow again, but again, make sure that you log out to System1 first to avoid issues. Hit OK, and the configuration file should be closed as well. Now let's hit run again. And we got another error after the second run. So let's inspect our output panel. So now the next error came from the close pop-up window. So it was not able to find the selector that we have for that activity. So that came from the System1 update work item. So let's open that workflow. And if we verify in here, yeah, it was not able to click the OK button and click this close button as well. All right, so this is a very tricky error. So as a quick fix for this, we will be just adding a delay in our workflow, like a 5 seconds delay, so that after that 5 seconds delay, it will be able to click this OK activity. So let me close this first, hit that, and now let me go to activity tab and look for delay activity and drag that between the click update work item and click pop up OK. So here we will just use a 5 seconds value. It's a time span field, so we need to use a time span value. So this is the 5 seconds. Hit OK. So instead of using delay, you can also utilize the property of update work item delay after. This is in milliseconds. So if you will use 5 seconds here, you will input 5,000. Or you can also use the delay before properties of the click pop-up OK, and that is also in milliseconds. So after adding the or after making the changes, whichever you prepare, please make sure to save your workflow and then make sure to log out to System1 application before we run another test. And then, yep, make sure the configuration file is closed as well. So now we can run another test, and I hope this is the last one. I hope there's no more errors. Let's click now, run. All right, so now you see that there's a bit of delay before clicking the OK button in our dialog. That is because we add the delay activity with 5 seconds value. All right, so I guess we have a successful test in there. So let me just check my output panel in here. So here it shows that the program was able to process 14 transactions. And okay, the transaction count is also 14. But to verify, let's go to our Acme System 1. Make sure to verify or do this as well before you submit your project in UiPath Academy. So ensure that all the calculate client security hash item in the work items page is with a status of completed, because if there's at least one, that will be deducted to your point. So seems good. Let's go to the last page. And my last item here is also tag as completed. So make sure to verify that. And before you upload your project in the UiPath Academy, do not reset the test data. Please take note of that. Do not reset the test data before you submit your project and until you don't get your result. And another thing that I was not able to mention in this video is that on the get transaction data workflow, so open that get transaction data workflow. Here on the second if activity, I made something wrong in here. Uh, we need to make sure that in this condition, use the less than or equal for the condition. I was wrong because here in our assigned transaction item, I overlooked that we are subtracting 1 to our transaction number. So you need to make sure that this condition is less than or equal. Because if not, then one of your last calculate client security hash item here might not be or might not get processed by the program. So please take note of that as well before you submit your final project in the UiPath Academy. And there again, we had a successful test of our project. I hope you had the same result. If you encounter a different error, please try to solve it first. I tried to cover this exercise in detail and I hope I explained everything we use in this project. So the last step for this video is to show you how to upload this exercise to UiPath Academy and see if I pass the exercise. Alright, so now I will be uploading the project I created to UiPath Academy and see if I pass the exercise. And again, a reminder to you guys before you upload your project in the UiPath Academy, make sure that you don't reset your test data because that will be used for checking your uh, project. And then here, let's start with zipping this activity. So let's go to Project Explorer in here and then make sure to go outside that folder and then I will create a zip file of that folder and then once that is ready, go to UiPath Academy, log in to your account, the same account that you use in Orchestrator and Acme System 1. Those needs to be the same. If not, you will have a problem. So let's go to learning by role and then look for the RPA developer advanced. Let's go to one with the latest version. And then let's look for the practice with REFramework. I will open that course. And then here, I will now start this and upload my project. So now I will upload the file that I zip. So let me go to my documents and UiPath. So this is our crash course. So I'll select that and click submit and hit yes. All right. It shows submitted, so what's my score? I forgot how many years ago the last time I did this. So I'm not sure if I should refresh this page maybe. I will try to refresh the page. And here you can see that I have completed this exercise and I got 100 points. So if you follow everything that I shared on the video, you will probably get the same score. So alright, so that is all for this crash course. If I hope you learn how to use the framework while we apply it to one of the advanced UiPath exercises. If you like this content, please click the like button and subscribe if you haven't subscribed. I will upload a copy of this project to my website codingmodule.com. I will also produce documentation there and I hope you can visit that. I will be uploading additional content soon for UiPath, aiming to help others to make this learning journey easy. So, see you in the following video. Bye, guys.